I still remember a look back when times were hard but wonderful. The real-life story of Ken Binkley and one of Nashville's best-known stock car racing families. From the age of 6 years old, 1947, until the finish of these pages in the year of our Lord, 2010. A walk through the good, bad, and ugly. A story that is meant to share the values that can only come from the faith in the one and only true God, Jesus the Christ. No flowers, no bright packages, just life. Life that will make you laugh, smile, and cry as you look through the eyes of the author, Ken Binkley. I still remember rascals, racing, roots, religion. When times were hard, boys became men. I am the middle of 12 kids, 8 boys and 4 girls, all of whom were born to Jesse Roy and Mary Helen Binkley. We were raised in northeast Nashville, Tennessee, a few blocks from the Cumberland River on Hancock Street, our final childhood home. It was also within walking distance of the old American Legion Bowl dirt track that sat almost on the bank of the Cumberland River, which was my very first childhood memory. The Cumberland was an unruly old river that at times seemed to have a mind of its own. It would not stay within its banks, especially in late winter and early spring. It was almost an oddity for a year to go by without the river flooding most of North 1st, Joseph, and at times North 2nd Streets. It was a real mess to clean up. Of course, right in the middle of this was the old dirt track that always would fall victim to the river's rage. It now runs alongside I-65 in northeast Nashville. This was and is a part of my life story. It seemed that every year in about February, the rains would come, and sometimes ice and snow, which added misery to the carnage. This, however, did not seem to discourage anyone. They just cleaned it up and went on with life. I remember year after year, Mr. Donahoe would have us kids put a lot of things up high in the concession stands so the water couldn't reach it. There was always a water line on the wall from the previous flood, and everything had to go above that line. Now, they also had a big trailer that could be loaded to be carried to higher ground. This contained mostly office things, paper cups, soft drinks, and tobacco products. At times, Mr. Donahoe's brother would be seen taking a lap in his boat. He mainly was checking for damage to parts of the track. Our photos show one such occasion. In the early spring, it was time to start preparing for the upcoming racing season, which usually lasted from April until about October. None of us kids had any idea what would befall us after the water had receded, but we always looked forward to cleanup time, for this was when we made big money. Sometimes we would make between 25 cents and a whole dollar for a day's work. I know this sounds like a small amount of money, but not to us then. We seldom saw a whole dollar at one time. Sometimes the mud was so thick you couldn't wear shoes. That didn't matter much to us, for we seldom wore shoes anyway, except when we were made to. We didn't get cuts on our feet very often. I guess our feet were tough, or else we just didn't pay any attention to it. We would shovel the thick mud out, preparing for the fire department to hose the residue out. This was always a fun time because when it was warm enough, the spray from the hose would find its way to us kids. In my younger life, we only lived in 3 houses. I was born on Joseph Street, directly behind where the Salvation Army headquarters now stands, where once stood the Economy grocery store. On the other side was the High-Low supermarket, where most every bite of food was bought. We called it a supermarket because the store it replaced, Green's Grocery, was about half the size of High-Low. We will revisit this part of my life a little later in this book. The building in front of my birthplace was originally built as a Union Hall, but is now the home of the Salvation Army. Soon after that, we moved around the corner to Grace Street. This house was near where we made our final move to 305 Hancock Street, where most of my childhood was spent. We were possibly one of the poorest families in the Nashville area, but it didn't seem to matter, for everyone around us was in the same boat. Hand-me-down clothes and shoes were just a way of life. We were always glad to get something different. Whether our folks bought it, it was a hand-me-down, or it came from charity. I can honestly say that we were, for the most part, a close family that truly had love for one another. I really don't know why we all drifted apart, other than some chose a different lifestyle than others. I chose later in life to follow the Christian way, as did others in the family, while others chose to party and have a big time. I guess some felt that we thought we were too good to hang with them, but that was never on my mind. I loved my family, but we just didn't mix after a while. To this day, we still don't see one another until someone dies. It breaks my heart, but I'm as much to blame as any of the others. Daddy always said, all doors swing both ways, and the telephone rings on both ends. I recall when I was about 6 years old, we often played in what we called Frog Bottom. It was at about that time they began to plan the dirt track that would eventually become the American Legion Bowl. It seems Jimmy Sawyer or someone laid out the track by driving his personal car around in the tall weeds until he got the layout he wanted. Soon the heavy equipment moved in, and the racetrack was born. Of course, we didn't even know what a racetrack was at that time, but it would soon become the main focal point of our young lives. We actually watched them build that old dirt track, and our little footprints were all over those grounds. We would get there a couple of hours early in hopes of getting to sell popcorn or something that night. Mr. Donahoe had a regular crew, but sometimes they didn't show up, and he would let one of us take their place. The bigger kids got to sell Cokes, and the younger kids would sell the lighter things. We also would pick up the empty bottles after the races were over, because the drink companies would sometime deliver on Sunday, or at least early on Monday morning. I didn't like that job very much because I was too little to carry a whole case of empties. Don't forget, all bottles back then carried a penny or two in deposits. Until this time, I understand they raced at the old Cumberland Airstrip at the end of 9th Avenue North. The new track operated as the Legion Bowl for a few years and then was purchased by a team that consisted of Bill Donahoe, Mark Parrish, and Benny Goodman. I still remember drivers like Jimmy Sawyer, Bob Ruther, Frank Reed, Pete Udaly, Omar Jackson, Cuckoo Marlin, Jack Marlin, Pete Page, Bobby Walker, Flywheel McGuire, L.J. Hampton, Tony Formosa Sr., Orville Hurd, Dean Jennings, G.C. Spencer, Charlie and Wilburn Binkley, no relation, and Herb Lewis. Time would fail me if I tried to name them all. We, however, had a cousin back then by the name of Gifford Ray Davenport. This man was a legend in his own mind. He was dubbed the Rollover King because he would turn his car over at least twice a month. He was given a trophy once with the car upside down on it. I believe this is what started my brother Charlie's desire to drive a race car. The only photos I have of Gifford are of him in a wreck. Look closely at the car in the book, number 5, and note the dents in the car, especially in the roof. A lot of these drivers are still with us today, and some of the best times are when they attend the Old Timers meetings held several times a year. In the world of racing, these drivers are all my heroes because they helped mold our lives and taught us to be honest at all times. Although they were a little rough around the edges, they always took the time to talk to us kids, and I will never forget that. Cuckoo Marlin, 1954. Very few drivers lost their lives driving a race car. It seems we have kept them around for a long time. I thank God that my life included these guys instead of some so-called role models of today. My memory of Pappy Oates' garage are vivid ones. A lot of the pictures in the book taken from the walls of his office after he had passed away, and the building just sat there. It would be impossible for me to count the times he ran us kids out of his shop saying, "Go home. Don't you know kids are not supposed to play around here? You might get hurt, and your mama and daddy will give me a fit." We could get old tires from his dump pile and play with them until we wore completely off what little tread those tires had left. I don't know how some of us made it to adulthood with all of the things we did, like playing with mercury from the place that made thermometers, sliding down Taylor's Hill on cardboard boxes, swinging out into the river on a cable and dropping off maybe 50 feet from the bank, playing around Bush Brickyard. I could go on and on. Time and time again, I could hear my parents say, "You all better be careful playing around those old brickyards." We would just say, "Don't worry." Hours were spent there in early spring and most of the summer after the floodwaters had receded and left behind swimming holes. Though it was dangerous, we still waited for the water to warm up enough so we could get out of our clothes and into the sometimes still icy water. We were, however, careful not to get our clothes muddy because that would spell trouble at home. You see, we only had a couple changes of clothes, and we had to take care of them or else wear stained clothes to school. I still think because of our poverty, we learned that if we had better not abuse it because we knew Daddy couldn't afford to buy us more if we got it. Besides, we had to hand our clothes down to the next youngest boy or one of our cousins. I still remember the first pair of Levi's I got. My oldest brother Billy had me wash his car, and he gave me $5. The Levi's cost $4.11. I couldn't wait to show them off, so I changed in Morris's restroom and went to the movies across the street from the clothing store. I stood outside a while so everyone could see my new jeans. They weren't hard to spot since I left the paper tag on the pocket. I didn't care. I was in heaven. It was pretty good. A new pair of jeans and a movie on only $5. Those were the days. I still remember the last movie I saw at the Roxy. It was Bonnie and Clyde. The most memorable movie I ever saw there, which is still my favorite movie of all times, was in 1950, To Please a Lady, starring Clark Gable and Barbara Stanwyck. Of course, it was a racing movie, and I believe Clark Gable got killed in the end. The Three Stooges and Little Rascals were my favorite comedies, and I can't forget the wonderful cartoons that were so unlike the demonic ones that children are exposed